What's the little lab rat up to this time?
And so, our look at the PlayStation's launch lineup ends not with a bang, nor with a whimper, but somewhere in between with Kileak, the DNA Imperative. Kileak is a mech-based first-person shooter that debuted first in Japan in January of 1995, and later became a PlayStation launch title in North America. It's worth noting that Kileak is the very first first-person shooter ever released for the PlayStation, in North America at least. In Japan, that honor goes to the hybrid dungeon crawler FPS Crime Crackers. We'll cover that one soon. Kileak is developed by Genki, a Japanese studio founded in 1990 by a couple of ex-Sega employees. Before Kileak, Genki focused on the racing genre on the Super NES, creating games like Redline F1 Racer, Michael Andretti's IndyCar Challenge, and GP1. Genki later made a few games for the 3DO interactive multiplayer before it started developing for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. As for why a developer known for its racing games suddenly shifted to first-person shooters for Kileak and its follow-ups, I'm guessing that Genki was contracted by Sony to fill a niche in the PlayStation's library, as Kileak is published by Sony Music Entertainment Incorporated in Japan. Sony also published the English-language versions in North America and Europe. Kileak doesn't deliver much in terms of story after the opening cinematic. A rogue scientist, Dr. Kim, is conducting some kind of forbidden genetic experiments at the South Pole, and as a member of the International Peacekeeping Force, you're out to stop him. Your transport gets shot down on the way, but you and a partner shrug off the crash landing and head into the Doctor's 15th-floor dungeon. As far as gameplay goes, well, as you can probably tell from the action here, it's no Doom. In fact, though it shares some superficial similarities with Doom, Kileak actually has more in common with contemporary mech games for the 3DO. Kileak seems to take specific inspiration from Iron Angel of the Apocalypse, a first-person shooter that launched for the 3DO in Japan in 1994. Coincidentally, Iron Angel of the Apocalypse also stars a robot-like character who's also trying to kill an evil scientist. Early 3D mech games weren't really known for their fast action. They tended to focus more on simulating the experience of piloting a mechanical suit of armor with a ton of firepower. This kind of became a thing during the 32-bit era in Japan, thanks in no small part to the popularity of mecha anime and manga series like Gundam and Macross, and the genre evolved quickly. Jumping ahead a couple of years, From Software's Armored Core took a more action-oriented approach to mech games in 1997. Capcom would later follow the concept to its logical conclusion with Steel Battalion, a first-person mech game for the original Xbox that required a massive control panel setup, complete with foot pedals and an emergency eject button. Back in 1995, though, 3D mech games often had a more deliberate pace, and while it can be argued that a slower pace more accurately simulates the experience of piloting a hulking metal death machine, Kileak just comes across as awkward and kind of unfair. Much of Kileak's gameplay involves exploring long stretches of identical corridors. At some point, you'll find a locked door that blocks the elevator to the next floor, and that's when you need to explore a bunch of side rooms until you find the keycard that you need to progress. You'll also find new weapons and armor upgrades along the way. It's simple enough in concept, but the enemies in each level will put up a real fight if you're not paying attention. Many ambush you in the middle of long hallways, leaving you no room to dodge or circle strafe. You'll just have to soak up bullets until you either retreat or kill the enemy. As you can see in the footage here, I eventually started tanking damage and focused on ending encounters as quickly as possible, instead of trying to fight strategically. Believe it or not, you actually lose less health that way. Other enemies are less threatening. The ones behind doors often get stuck on the level geometry as you enter, giving you a chance to take them out before they can attack. New enemies are introduced every floor or two, but there's little variation in their attack patterns. You're basically fighting the same robot types throughout the entire game. Actually, the lack of enemy variety and the boxy map layouts make Kileak seem less like a first-person shooter and more like a classic-style dungeon crawler with real-time combat. Strategy, if you can call it that, mostly boils down to ammo conservation and energy management. See, many of your weapons tap into your mech's battery life, so you need to carefully balance how much of your battery you want to spend on firepower before you switch to your guns that have limited ammunition. It's a solid enough gameplay structure in that it forces you to carefully explore dangerous territory with limited resources, but in practice it just becomes kinda dull after a while. Each level has at least one of these battery recharge stations, and once you find one, you're going to want to backtrack to it whenever you run low on battery life. The ideal way to play Kileak is to use battery-powered weapons as much as possible, so that you can save your bigger guns for boss fights. The problem is that backtracking is so slow. You can spend minutes in each level backtracking whenever your battery runs low, meaning that much of Kileak's gameplay boils down to retracing your steps through these long, featureless hallways. And if that's not enough, the entire time your onboard computer is reminding you every 5 seconds that your battery is running low. God, I know! And that's all there is to it, really. Kileak has 15 floors in total. The first 5 basically amount to a series of metal corridors, and floors 6 through 10 are pretty much exactly the same thing, only you're exploring underground caves instead. The rest of the floors in the game are a clever mixture of cave and corridor. I got to floor 9 before I ran out of patience with Kileak, mainly due to these creatures that fire at you from the ceiling. For some reason, you need to hold down the L1 and R1 buttons on the PlayStation controller at the same time to make your mech aim upward. This also locks you in place and makes you an easy target. It's around here where you start taking more damage in battle than you could ever hope to recover by killing enemies and collecting health pickups, and the whole thing just begins to feel kinda pointless. I guess the best thing about Kileak is its sense of isolation. You don't really encounter any human characters during the game, aside from the occasional comms call from your partner, and if it were executed just a little bit better, Kileak could actually be pretty creepy. I can see it being this really tense game where you're sneaking through an abandoned research station and ducking into side rooms to avoid patrolling robots. I assume the underground tunnels where the game takes place were full of human researchers at some point, and it'd be interesting to collect clues and piece together the events that led up to the robot takeover. This just doesn't happen in Kileak. It's pretty much just all shooting with very little story. There's barely even any puzzles to solve. There's a good premise here, but Genki couldn't quite pull it off in the end. What little story there is in Kileak is kinda messed up. As you go through the game, you find these audio logs that reveal that Dr. Kim is performing genetic experiments with this thing called Kileak.
Kim, what the hell are you doing? No one gave you the authority to go this far.
Shut up, you fool! Everything has changed. From now on, I'm the one in charge.
Kileak, you're mad. Who do you think you are? God?
Which is actually an ancient alien creature that spawned all life on Earth millions of years ago. He's doing this so that he can create a perfect race of superhumans with the aim of putting a forceful end to the non-stop ethnic conflicts and genocide that engulfs the planet in the game's timeline. By the way, this all happens years after a quote-unquote Middle Eastern country detonates a nuclear weapon in 2009. Another fun thing you'd never know about Kileak's story without reading the manual is that Dr. Kim's research is funded by a major multinational conglomerate that came to power as the race wars continued. Headquartered in Chile and rumored to be staffed by German immigrants, it invests the bulk of its profits into researching things like genetic engineering and human cloning. This corporation also happens to have strict hereditary requirements for leadership, and its director of operations is internally called the Führer. Subtle. Maybe Kileak pulls a bionic commando at the end and you get to shoot Hitler in the face. Anyway, less than a year after the launch of Kileak, Genki released a direct sequel in Japan, which later arrived stateside under the title Epidemic. From what I've seen of it, it seems very similar to the original Kileak, though it looks like it has bigger environments with wider hallways. I guess that was a common complaint. Critics at the time liked it about as much as they liked the original Kileak, which isn't saying much. A year after Epidemic, Genki released another first-person mech game, BRAHMA Force, The Assault on Belt Logger 9. Man, that's a chunky title right there. I remember this one being much faster paced than Kileak. It had a better variety of weapons, and you could actually jump, so you weren't just stuck sliding across metal floors the whole game like you were in Kileak. Genki never returned to mech simulators afterward because in between Epidemic and BRAHMA Force, the studio released a PlayStation game called Shutoko Battle: Drift King. The Shutoko Battle series was first introduced on the Super Famicom, but it became a huge hit on the PlayStation and spawned a whole bunch of sequels. The Shutoko Battle games have kind of a fractured history over here in North America, since new games in the series would get picked up by different publishers. These games would then get released under different titles, like Tokyo Extreme Racer, Tokyo Highway Battle, and Street Supremacy, leaving little clue to their lineage. The most recent console game in the series was released as Import Tuner Challenge on the Xbox 360. And so, like many other Japanese developers at the time, Genki eventually found its voice and direction on the PlayStation, but it wasn't with Kileak. At the time, developers struggled to follow through on ambitious game concepts while they were still coming to grips with new console hardware. Kileak isn't bad for a launch-era PlayStation game, but it proved that the mech simulation genre wasn't quite ready to blossom on consoles just yet. Luckily, with From Software's Armored Core just a few years away, mech fans wouldn't have long to wait for a worthwhile successor. And that's it! We've covered the first batch of PlayStation games released in North America. We did it! Next up, I think it's time we look at the Japanese games that hit the PlayStation in 1994, many of which are more primitive and bizarre than the kind of stuff we got in the West. See you then.